Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Deborah DeBruin, and I direct the Center for Bioethics at the University of Minnesota, and I want to welcome you all to this edition of our Ethics Grand Round series. I'd like to begin with some housekeeping items, just to make sure that we all know the plan for the day. If you have questions for the speaker, please use the Q&A function, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen. We'll be monitoring that, and we'll address those questions after the talk, but you can feel free to enter your questions in the Q&A function at any time. If you have any tech issues, please feel free to use the chat, and our support staff will address it with you privately. If you use the chat for tech issues and the Q&A function for your questions, it allows us to better keep those issues separate as we're managing the event today. Biomedical engineering students, if you could please email our general Center for Bioethics email address, that is bioethx@umn.edu. You'll see it there on the screen, and indicate your attendance. Then we can help to make sure that you get credit for your attendance today with your program. Next slide, please. I would like to thank our co-sponsors for today. You can see there's a lot of interest in Dr. Lyerly's talk across the university, and we are really pleased to be able to partner in this interdisciplinary and interprofessional way across campus. The center likes to make it a priority to engage these sorts of partnerships. So today, the co-sponsors for this talk are the Women's Health Research Program, the Program in Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies, the College of Pharmacy, the Department of Obstetrics, Gynecology, and Women's Health, the Clinical and Translational Science Institute, the Center on Women, Gender, and Public Policy in the Humphrey School, the Medical School, and the School of Nursing. We want to thank all of them for their partnership and really welcome them and their colleagues to this event. Next slide, please. Without further ado, then, I would like to introduce you to today's speaker, Dr. Ann Lyerly. Dr. Lyerly is Professor of Social Medicine and Associate Director of the Center for Bioethics at the University of North Carolina. She's also Research Professor in Obstetrics and Gynecology. Her research addresses socially and morally complex issues in women's health and reproductive medicine, with a focus on how women and men assign meaning to reproductive events. A central goal of her work is to inform and reframe debates based on the views of the women and men most profoundly affected by them, and to appropriately weight these individuals' interests in shaping reproductive health care. Dr. Lyerly co-founded the Obstetrics and Gynecology Risk Research Group, which brought together experts from medical epidemiology, anthropology, obstetrics and gynecology, philosophy, bioethics, gender theory, and medical humanities for research on how risk is assessed and managed in the context of pregnancy. She's also a founder of the Second Wave Initiative, an effort to address women's health needs during pregnancy through responsible inclusion of pregnant women and their interests in biomedical research. She is PI on the NIH-funded PHASES project to advance equitable inclusion of pregnant women in HIV research, whose products include formal ethics guidance for advancing the evidence base for pregnant women and HIV and co-infections. In addition, she co-led a Wellcome Trust funded project to advance equitable inclusion of pregnant women in research on Zika and other public health emergencies. She's addressed a range of topics in reproductive medicine, including a stem cell research and frozen embryo disposition, miscarriage, maternal fetal surgery, vaginal birth after cesarean, conscience in the provision of reproductive care, and other issues. She's the author of A Good Book, A Good Birth. It is a good book. Okay. I highly recommend it. She's the author of A Good Birth, which is a book based on findings about the Good Birth Project, describing what constitutes a good birth from the perspectives of childbearing women. Dr. Lyerly has been supported by the National Institutes of Health, the Wellcome Trust, and the Greenwall Foundation. Her work has appeared in numerous journals, including Science, the Journal of the American Medical Association, the New England Journal of Medicine, the Hastings Center Report, and the American Journal of Public Health, as well as the New York Times and the Huffington Post. She was the chair of the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists Committee on Ethics from 2007 to 2009, and co-chair of the 2009 Program Committee of the American Society of Bioethics and Humanities. She has served on numerous national committees, including the March of Dimes, National Bioethics Committee, and the National Institutes of Health Advisory Committee to the Directors Working Group on Stem Cell Research. As you can tell from this brief bio, she is a leading voice in women's health and reproductive ethics, and we are really honored to have her join us here today. Dr. Lyerly, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay. Does that look right? Yep.
Perfect.
Good, good. Thank you. Well, clearly one thing I need to work more on is my facility with Zoom, even though I've been practicing a lot recently, but please forgive the delay there. I want to begin by thanking Dr. DeBruin and her team for inviting me to this event today. Dr. DeBruin and I go way back, like more than 20 years. We did a bioethics fellowship together, and I learned a lot alongside her and from her, and I continue to. So it's a real delight to get to share a screen and an event today. So today I'm going to talk about something I have been working on for a very long time, which is ethics research and pregnancy. But so what I want to do today is talk about progress as well as continued challenges that stem from the underrepresentation of pregnant women, or we can say pregnant people. I think there's a growing movement toward using the term pregnant people. So you will hear me using that term today, and we can talk about the reasons why afterwards. But at any rate, the underrepresentation of pregnant people in biomedical research and the profound evidence gaps that have stemmed from that. So I've come to this topic, over the past 15 years from the standpoint of bioethics for a few reasons. One, because for years, ethics was blamed for the exclusion of pregnant people from research. It was given as the reason that we don't include them. It is also, and we've made this argument over time, colleagues of mine and I have, the reason that we must move past that tendency and responsibly include them as a matter of justice. And also, as I've come to realize, the solutions for moving forward come in part, not wholly, but come in part from ethics. So ethics was the problem, ethics is the reason, and ethics is a really important part of the solution. So as Deborah noted, I'm the PI on a NIH-funded project called the Phases Project, which is aimed at the development of ethics guidance for the responsible inclusion of pregnant people in the HIV and co-infections research agenda. And that is, we're coming to the end of this 7-year project and are very excited to have guidance that was launched last summer, and I'm excited to share it with you. But I'm actually going to start today not with HIV and not exactly with the Phases Project, but basically where we are, which is in a pandemic. Let me see if I can advance my slides here.
Dr. Lyerly,
Yeah.
sorry for the interruption. Is it possible for you to put your slides into full screen mode?
Oh.
They are? Only because I can see your bottom icons in your computer.
Okay, so I wonder why they're not in full screen. See, I do need help with this. I'm going to just press escape here for a second, maybe. Because it,
maybe the view button up top.
View. Use slideshow, maybe?
Try that.
Is that better?
That's great.
Okay, good. All right. Sorry about that. So where we are in a global pandemic, wishing that I could be having dinner with my friends at the University of Minnesota tonight, but here at home in Chapel Hill. So I think that this moment has, revealed deep complexities that are not particularly about COVID, and research with pregnancy is no exception to that. So I'm going to start with the news last December that many were very thrilled to hear about the authorization of 2 vaccines for use against COVID-19. So as many of you, maybe all of you know, the ACIP identified priority groups for vaccination, right? So we don't have enough vaccines for everybody, so who gets it first? So phase 1A, healthcare workers and long-term care facility residents. Phase 1B, persons aged greater than or equal to 75 and frontline essential workers. And phase 1C, persons aged 65 to 75 years and persons younger with high-risk medical conditions, including pregnancy. Now, why am I telling you this? Well, the reason is that pregnant people are widely represented across priority groups. About the same time that the announcement of the vaccines was made public, the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists offered a practice advisory. They noted, first of all, that those vaccines had not been tested in pregnant people, and there were no pregnancy-specific data. The second thing they said, which I thought was pretty interesting and pretty remarkable, and you'll understand this why later, was that COVID vaccines should not be withheld from pregnant individuals who meet criteria for vaccination based on ACIP recommended priority groups. They also said that pregnancy testing should not be a requirement prior to receiving any approved COVID-19 vaccine. So why did ACOG take this stand? So practically speaking, what we know about COVID-19 and pregnancy is that pregnancy increases the risks of COVID. So pregnant people have an increased risk for severe illness. They have increased risk associated with comorbidities. So if you have a risk factor for COVID and you're pregnant, it's not just those 2 factors added together, it multiplies in a certain way. They have increased risk for ICU admission, mechanical ventilation, preterm birth, and death. And Black and Hispanic individuals bear disproportionate burden of infection, morbidity, and death, including in the context of pregnancy. Obviously, the decision to make a vaccine, to take a vaccine for anybody, including pregnant people, is whether there are risks that would disincline you to use the vaccine. So within several weeks, there was enough known about the COVID vaccine for ACOG to feel confident that the decision was one that was appropriate for pregnant people to make along with their healthcare providers. So generally, when we think about vaccine risk in pregnancy, there aren't a lot of prospective studies generally done for vaccines. So we have to piece together what we can what we can have. So when it comes to mRNA vaccines, there are a couple of things to know. One has to do with theoretical risk. So the mRNA platform is a platform that's kind of in this gray area. So most of the vaccines that are recommended in pregnancy are in fact, all of the ones that are widely recommended are not live. So they're killed vaccines, they don't replicate. And we feel, as a OBGYN community, we feel very confident and very safe with that platform because we have a long history of use and no apparent harm, and some really good studies. That's not what the mRNA vaccine. There's another category of vaccine called live vaccines. And the idea with live vaccines is that in theory, scientifically, it's possible that those vaccines could replicate and cause harm to a fetus. Now, it turns out that while live vaccines are almost taboo in pregnancy, the data suggests that they are quite safe. But we're going to put that fact aside and just note that there are live vaccines. The mRNA vaccines are not live vaccines. So what the scientific community believes is that there is no theoretical risk associated with the mRNA vaccine. It also turns out that they eventually did studies on animals, really toward the end of the phase 2 and 3 studies. Usually these studies are, these tests on animals are very expensive, they're usually delayed. But when they did do them, they did not see any adverse signals in the animal studies, in reproductive toxicology studies. The other consideration that is sometimes brought up is whether there's something in the human studies of non-pregnant people that would make us worry, like common risks of high fever, which we don't like to see in pregnancy. They can cause harm to women as well as to their offspring. But that wasn't one of the things that we were worried about with the mRNA vaccine. So what we're missing here are human pregnancy data. And so, there's been a lot written about this. So what this does is this puts pregnant people in a very difficult position, especially pregnant people who happen to be frontline workers, who happen to be healthcare workers, who happen to have comorbid conditions, who have been hiding away or worrying or triple masking or whatever it is over the last several months about whether to take the vaccine, which has not been tested in pregnant people, or to continue along and interface with the risks of COVID, right? Now, the thing is that it's really nice that people are calling attention to the fact that this is a dilemma and it's terrible for people to have to think about this, because over the years there has been waxing and waning attention to the fact that this is actually the kind of decision that many pregnant people have to make all the time, because most of the drugs that are used to treat conditions that pregnant people have not been rigorously tested in pregnancy. And so they always have to take medications with trust and assurance that it's the best thing to do, but without the data that other individuals have. So that's really, making that not a fact for pregnant people is really at the heart and soul of what the work I've been doing over the last couple of decades is to change that really problematic state of affairs. So this has been a kind of a long journey. So it was early I'm going to quickly kind of tell you about it, and then I have a lot of ground to cover, but tell you a little bit how we got to the Phases Project, and then I'll tell you a little bit about the Phases Project, and I would encourage you to read about the Prevent Project. It's on the web, but I'm just going to talk a little bit about second wave and phases today. And I will make comments about COVID too. We're not done with it yet. So the the second wave initiative was really a group coming together around this problem of the poor evidence base for pregnant people. And the initial effort of the second wave initiative was to make the argument that the continued exclusion of pregnant people from research was actually unethical. It was an unethical state of affairs. Once we made that argument, then the question became how. How do you attend to all of the barriers that have been put up for inclusion of pregnant people in research? And that's where the Phases and Prevent project came in. They were about getting a little bit more granular and mapping an ethical pathway forward. So why do we call it the second wave? Well, the first wave, as we second wavers conceive it anyway, had to do with efforts toward the inclusion of women as research subjects. So in the early 1990s, women were noted to be underrepresented in research. They were excluded from studies, and their health concerns were not investigated. There were many alleged justifications for their exclusion. One of the things that people said was, women's bodies are complicated. Their physiologies, their menstrual cycles, all that estrogen, that complicates our studies. And we really just want a nice plain man to do our original research on. Now, I want to tell you that you have to go back and read Dr. de Bruin's gorgeous article on why that's not okay. She has a chapter in a 1994 Institute of Medicine report, as well as an article in the Kennedy Institute of Ethics Journal, and she introduced the notion of androcentrism, the theory of androcentrism, to a wide scientific audience, and we still hear people using that term today. And I really credit Deborah for socializing the concept, if you will. Another alleged justification that people offered was that not doing research with women was protecting them, protecting women, protecting fetuses. Of course, that you protect people from research risks, but you end up with a poor evidence base. And then the third was that there would be recruitment difficulties, that women wouldn't want to participate in research. So these were all pretty quickly and flatly and beautifully, as I mentioned before, dismissed. In 1993, the Revitalization Act was passed, which included new requirements for inclusion of women and minorities in research. You have to justify exclusion on the basis of on a basis other than cost. So anybody who has NIH research grants knows now that these are requirements. You have to have a gender and diversity balance, not at least as an aspiration. It's not always a requirement for continued funding, although we're getting there. The women are now the majority of research participants, although in many areas gaps remain. The problem, though, is that pregnant people were left behind. So even though women themselves were included in research, pregnant people were still summarily excluded. So the second wave was an effort, like I said, that started in the 2000s to include pregnant people as research subjects. Just centrally as a matter of justice, all people deserve, I missed a word there, access to safe and effective treatment throughout the lifespan, including during pregnancy, and deserve an evidence base adequate to that fact. And just, really a concept that I feel, in some ways very delighted has been socialized is that ethics requires protecting pregnant people, not from research, but through it. So, this has kind of been a labor of love because progress in some ways has been slow. So we are still profoundly lacking in pregnancy-specific data. This is a graph from an article that was published last year by Kathy Spong, who has worked in this, done some really great work in this area. And what she and her colleagues did was that they looked at drugs, that the labeling of drugs approved over the last 10 years, And basically, of drugs approved in the last 10 years, about 90% have animal data associated with them. And that's because it's usually a requirement to have animal reproductive toxicity data available, at least by the time it's approved, usually not in time to include pregnant people in, the phase 3 studies, but it has to be in by the time it's approved. But only 10% of the drugs approved in the last 10 years have any human pregnancy data associated with it. And many years there is no drugs with human pregnancy data. So limited or no data at the time of approval, and delays in gathering that information are extensive. And I mean like years to decades. So why? For some reason, I can't see the bottom of my slide. So I'm going to take one little second to see if I can just move something so I can see it a little better. Okay, it's a little better for me. Let's see. Sorry about that, guys, but it's going to start being important for me to be able to see it. Okay. So why is pregnancy-specific evidence so important? Well, there are at least 3 reasons why, and I'll go through them with a little bit more detail, but very briefly, one has to do with dosing. So pregnancy-specific data is needed to dose drugs appropriately. If you don't have it, can lead to toxicities or exposure to, undertreatment and exposure to disease. Fetal safety, the obvious one. If you don't know whether the drug affects the fetus and its developmental processes, you might prescribe a drug that could be harmful. And there's also the issue of reticence that I'll get into in a second. And then also there's maternal outcomes that need to be evaluated. So let's go through these one at a time in a little bit more detail. Well, let's see. I don't know why I'm having a little trouble advancing. Let's see if I do this. Okay, there. All right. So the first reason is, again, dosing. Many of you may know that pregnancy changes drug metabolism and dosing. So the pregnant body is very different than the non-pregnant body. So the blood volume increases, the kidney processes are more, kidneys process more blood, the liver enzymes change, the digestive system changes, everything's different, and that can affect the ways that drugs are metabolized and in the way they act on the body. And that really the pharmacokinetics of the drugs. So a dearth of pharmacokinetic data, and this is a slide that I've often used for my to really talk about phases. There's a dearth of pharmacokinetic data for almost everything, I'll tell you, but even in the HIV context for treatment, prevention, and co-infections. And the average delay for approved antiretrovirals in HIV is 6 years. The average delay for pharmacokinetics in other spaces is much longer. So what are the harms I mentioned before? One of the harms is underdosing. So the normal dose of a drug might not be enough to treat disease. So that the person who believes that they took the risk, they took their advice of their doctor, they took the drug, and then it turns out the drug is metabolized so fast that it doesn't adequately treat their infection, their cancer, whatever disease they have. So they're exposed to the risks of harm, but not the benefits of the drug. Or overdosing. There's some drugs that are not metabolized as quickly, and so the normal adult dose could lead to side effects and toxicities. So an example of this from the HIV literature that's just very recent is a drug called cobicistat, and it is a drug that boosts the effects of antiretrovirals, and it's prescribed in combination with some antiretrovirals. And It was approved a while back and it was prescribed widely. And then a pharmacokinetic study of cobicistat was done, and it revealed that the dose of cobicistat seen by the pregnant body, given its change in metabolism, was much lower, raising concerns about breakthrough of HIV infection, perinatal transmission, et cetera. So the finding that the pregnant body metabolized cobicistat so quickly, learned later, raised the question of whether, it had exposed pregnant people to harms. And it's actually, interestingly, it is now contraindicated in pregnant people. The decision was made to take it off sort of the registry of drugs for pregnant people rather than figuring out the correct dose, which is something we can talk about. Of course, the second reason that you need pregnancy-specific data is the thing that has kept pregnant people out of research in the first place, which is fetal safety. So the safety of drugs for fetuses is a prominent concern. Most drugs come to market with data from animals only. I always tell this story. I was on an FDA panel, and they were talking about how really there's animal data for many drugs. And one of the folks on the panel was asked, well, what do you tell your patients if there is a 10 times risk of a, or a risk of a cleft palate from a drug at, 10 times the dose in a certain rat, say. And my colleague said, well, then I tell them, if you're a rat, you shouldn't take this drug at 10 times the dose. So the point is that animal data do not always track very closely with human data. So there are problems with translatability, and people always say this is the best we can do, but it's really not that great. It's not that sensitive, and it's probably more sensitive than it's specific, but I haven't actually been able to get the teratologist to agree on how accurate these animal data are in predicting risk. The thing to know about fetal harm is there are very, 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 very few strong teratogens. So thalidomide is the one that people always think of. But usually when we're thinking about risks of structural defects, we're talking about an increased risk of something that is very, very rare. And it's an increase by enough that is statistically significant, but it's still a pretty rare thing. And so you need a lot of exposures to get a sense of whether there is an increased risk. And so oftentimes this is kind of a thing that needs to be captured post-approval. And the delays in characterizing risk are extensive. Again, years to decades, 27 years by one estimate. So the harms of not having the fetal safety data include the potential for inappropriate risk, so prescribing something that may be teratogenic, or actually more importantly and more relevantly, I think, and more commonly, barriers to access. I'm going to skip my malaria and TB examples and go on to COVID, back to COVID here. So I think that this is a very interesting example, and I hope I can convey it accurately. This is the first time I've tried to explain this to anybody. But one of the things that happened is that the World Health Organization also made recommendations around the mRNA vaccines in January. And in contrast to ACOG that said, look, we know there isn't a lot of data, but the decision should be made this should be a decision made between pregnant people and their physician. The World Health Organization on January 27th said that pregnant people should not use the mRNA vaccine unless the benefit of vaccinating a pregnant woman outweighs the potential vaccine risks. Now, like I said before, no risks have been identified, right? So the purported risk-benefit measuring is the benefit of avoiding COVID versus uncertainty. unknown risks, fear, right? So there was actually quite a backlash to this, this recommendation. And so 2 days later, the WHO actually clarified their position. They said they did not change it, but what they said is it was really a shift in framing, which was that pregnant people may be vaccinated in consultation with their health provider, but limited the individuals that they considered to be candidates for vaccination to people at increased risk over pregnancy. So pregnant healthcare workers or pregnant frontline workers or pregnant people with comorbidities, but pregnant people who are already at increased risk from COVID were not included in that recommendation. So again, this is kind of what made ACOG's position remarkable, because what they said right up front, anticipating this reticence from the absence of data, was that COVID-19 vaccinations should not be withheld from pregnant individuals who meet criteria for vaccination based on priority group. So I taught a section of grad students about this, and we talked about this for 30 minutes. So I'm happy to talk about this in the question and answer, but I think it's just a very interesting contemporary example of what we call reticence. Okay, the third reason I'm going to try to move this along is maternal outcomes. Drugs may carry risks specific to pregnancy, like preeclampsia, hemorrhage, and liver toxicity. And there's a tendency to focus on neonatal and pediatric outcomes when pregnant people are involved in research. So if you don't do research with pregnant people and you don't study in outcomes specific to pregnancy, you might know what the risks to the fetus or child are, but you can't think about them in the context of the risks and the benefits to the women. So the idea has been really that because people don't want to impose risk in the context of the research setting, they don't do the research. But when you do that, the risk doesn't go away. It just shifts into the clinical setting where it grows. So I hope that has been kind of made clear by those examples. So given the need for pregnancy-specific research, why are there these evidence gaps? Well, part of it has to do with the drug approval and development pathway. There is a lack of requirements for pregnancy-specific research, and many pharmaceutical companies lack incentives to do so, to do this kind of research. There is a really uncomfortable relationship between pregnant women and research. There's a lot of myths and misconceptions about what you can and can't do, what the federal guidelines allow you to do. There's a history of protectionism. So, the whole research ethics infrastructure came from research ethics abuses, and it's taken, many decades for us to move from thinking about the ethics of research as really protecting people just from the risks of research and toward a view of responsibly including them. IRB members have a lack of training, as do many researchers. Legal and logistical challenges abound, and there's a justificatory asymmetry. And what I mean by that is, if you're proposing a study, you have to justify inclusion of pregnant people in research. But if you don't want to include them, you don't have to justify not doing it. So it's easier just not to. And then we are not that great at managing risk in the context of pregnancy. And again, this is a whole talk here, but just to say there's a tendency to really think about women as environments, as vessels and vectors rather than ends in themselves. And there's all kinds of risk distortions that come with pregnancy, like noticing the risks of intervening, like noticing the risks of vaccinating, and not noticing the risks of not intervening, not noticing the risks of not vaccinating. So, despite the fact that we still have these massive, wide gaping holes in evidence, there is a cultural shift, which is part of what keeps keeping me going. So in 2016, the Cures Act established a group called PregLac, which is a working group that reported to the Secretary of Health and Human Services, and they produced a 400-page report about research in pregnancy and noted a cultural shift is necessary to emphasize the importance of gathering this data. The FDA recently issued draft guidance about inclusion of pregnant people in research gaps and noted that filling the knowledge gaps regarding safe and effective use of drugs is a critical public health need, but one that raises complex issues. So the issues that it raises are really the central concern of the Phases and Prevent projects. So as I said, the Phases project was originally funded in 2013 by the NIH, and it's an effort to characterize the barriers and opportunities, engage with the community, and develop ethical guidance for the challenges of conducting research in the HIV and co-infections context. We issued guidance last summer, and I'm going to be sharing that with you a little bit later. I mean, one of the things that I want to mention about Phases is that when we first started this project, people asked, why would you want to think about the gaps in the HIV context? Because HIV is one place where actually the paradigmatic research participant is the pregnant person, right? One of the greatest successes of the efforts against AIDS has been research that has clarified how to prevent maternal to child transmission. It's been tremendous, right? The thing is, though, it's really an interesting context to pursue guidance, because in contrast to prevention of maternal to child transmission efforts, other efforts like prevention of infection of pregnant people and treatment of comorbidities have not been attended to. So we have a community that's used to doing research with pregnant people, but there's been these blind spots and barriers put up, except in the maternal to child transmission space. So we have this really willing and able community to move forward. So the Phases project was a three-pronged effort to sort of make good on our argument that we need to move forward research with pregnant people. So it had three big pieces to it. One was engagement, which included a huge number of consultations with stakeholders, as well as empirical research with women. So this speaks to what Dr. De Bruin was mentioning, is that always, in my heart, I think what you need to do is you need to talk to the people who would be affected by any recommendations that you would make, and learn from them and figure out how to develop a responsive, moral analysis, as well as public policy proposals. So we did 140 interviews with stakeholders in the United States and Botswana, Malawi, and South Africa. And we also did 140 interviews with pregnant or recently pregnant people in Malawi and in the southeastern United States, and also did an ethical and legal analysis. Not going to be able to go into all of those findings, but just suffice it to say that they deeply informed eventually our guidance. We also did conceptual analytic research and then guidance development. So the guidance has turned out to be about an 80-page document, and it is authored by a working group of 26 experts from internationally and from across disciplines, ranging from OBGYN to philosophy to infectious disease. We have advocates for women living with HIV, folks from Africa, Europe, United States. So it's a really dynamic and incredible working group that came together around this guidance. And you can see their faces there. So the guidance, eventually I'll tell you about it as as concisely as I can. It's on our webpage. But there's two pieces to note about it. So the first is that the idea was to ground it in ethical foundations. So what are the what is the ethical grounding for making these 12 recommendations? So we grounded our recommendations in 3 such foundations, which include protection, access, and respect. So first is the idea that pregnant people deserve equitable protection from drug-related risks, right? As does everybody. So the mission of research is to gather evidence to decrease risks in clinical settings. Pregnant people and their offspring need and deserve such protection. And so exclusion from research doesn't eliminate risk. It exports them to the clinical setting where they expand. So again, one of the foundations is the need for equitable protection from drug-related risks, which I went over all the possible drug-related risks before. Equitable access to medications and vaccines is the second ethical foundation. So pregnant people deserve timely access to medications and vaccines. The lack of data leads to reticence. I showed you about what the work that reticence is doing right now. It also has created reticence around, for instance, the cutting edge medications for TB and malaria, which are deadly for pregnant people. So the lack of data leads to reticence to prescribe and take medications, and leads to cautions against use in public health guidance. And it leaves pregnant people and offspring exposed to the risks of disease or needing to use, kind of older and less effective, more toxic drugs. And then equitable respect for pregnant women's health. There's a tendency, as I've said before, for fetal or child outcomes to overshadow attention to maternal outcomes. Decision about research and treatment should reflect due consideration of the woman's health, and failure to do so treats her as a vessel or a vector rather than a person in her own right. We also grounded this guidance on 3 conceptual shifts, which I think characterize the whole landscape of research with pregnant people, and I think they bear repeating here. The first is the notion of moving from conceiving pregnant people as a vulnerable population to a complex population. So there's been this historical categorization of pregnant people as vulnerable. They were categorized along with children, people with mental disabilities, and prisoners as vulnerable in the federal guidances, which led to the idea that they needed to be, that there was something particularly problematic about conducting research with them. In 2018, they were removed from that designation. So pregnant women are no longer formally considered a vulnerable population, and rather many groups, including the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, has recommended using the term complex for them. And if anybody ever asks me to be on a panel about speaking about vulnerable populations, I say no, unless if you want me to talk about pregnant people, because they're not vulnerable. Again, this idea of protection from research, moving from protection from research to protection through research. I think I've kind of mentioned this a couple of times. And then the notion of moving from an idea of presumptive exclusion to fair inclusion. And what I mean by this is, up to very recently, the idea of doing research with pregnant women has been thought of as, it's super, it's going beyond. And you can presume that they'd be excluded from anything. And now the idea is it the right thing to include pregnant people in this research, and what would fair inclusion look like? So the phases guidance included 12 specific, concrete, and immediately actionable recommendations. So, we looked at, federal guidance and laws and things like that would take time to change, and decided for a couple of reasons. One is that action is needed now. And another is that, actually legally and and with regard to regulations, a lot can be done. So these recommendations operate within the current regulatory structure. So we don't need a lot of policy changes to make them happen. like I said, consistent with current regulatory frameworks and directed to multiple stakeholders across the arc of drug development and post-approval research. So this is not just to IRB members, this is not just to researchers, it's not just to advocates, it's to multiple stakeholders. So I'm gonna have to, kind of gallop through these recommendations. And again, there's a full treatment of them in our guidance document that's on the web, but I will do what I can to get through them. So they are grouped into 4 groups. So the first group has to do with building capacity, right? So this is about developing the will, the infrastructure, the community ethic that is needed to move this research forward. So one of the recommendations was that institutions that fund or oversee research should affirm the need to conduct research with pregnant women. This is why it was so important that the FDA endorsed the need for research with pregnant people. The idea has been, when we did our consultations, what we heard a lot was, I'd like to do this study, but I think, the IRB is not going to want to do it, or my research institution's not going to think it's important, or it's not going to look good on my resume. So there's a sense that there's a lot of willingness, but a lot of worry that there isn't willingness across the spectrum. So endorsement for affirmations of the need from leadership are important. We also found a lot of great resources for conducting research with pregnant people, but they're not grouped together in one place. So we recommended formalizing a global network for advocacy and resources, enhancing training. There's a lot of misconceptions and uncertainty in the IRBs and research communities. So enhancing the training are all important pieces of building capacity. I can't help myself. I've been following COVID, but I wanted to just let you all know that early in the pandemic, well, kind of middle of the pandemic, Elizabeth Warren actually proposed legislation that urged called the Maternal Health Pandemic Response Act. And in this letter, is available on her website, she noted that pregnant people have historically been left out of research agendas, and urged them to account for the unique risks and concerns of populations that have historically been excluded from pandemic research agendas. So, that didn't get the pregnant people into the early phase 2 and 3 trials that Pfizer and Moderna did. But I think it was a remarkable effort to endorse the importance of collecting these data. The second set of considerations was around supporting inclusion, which included designing studies for inclusion. So thinking about whether pregnant people could participate. What do you do when somebody falls pregnant on the study? Getting the DART studies done early enough so that they can participate if it makes sense. Review for and facilitate inclusion. So IRBs shouldn't just ask whether the range of things that they usually ask, but for individuals who decide to exclude pregnant people from their research, we've recommended that IRBs ask for a justification for their exclusion. Just asking for the justification, we believe, would make a big difference, and ensure equitable attention to pregnant women's own health needs. So if you're gathering data on an intervention in pregnancy, but all your data points have to do with pediatric and neonatal health, then you might want to think about including maternal health outcomes. So again, the idea of shifting the burden of justification from inclusion to exclusion. So asking individuals to justify why they would exclude an individual from a research study. Achieving priority research. So this idea of integrating pharmacokinetic studies earlier in the drug development process. So we have those pharmacokinetic data. At the time pregnant women start using these medications, enhance post-approval safety assessments. So there are really good ways to gather data about the safety of medications. But right now, efforts are somewhat disjointed and haphazard. So funding and organization around ensuring that when drugs are widely used by pregnant people, that data are collected on pregnancy outcomes, and addressing legacy evidence gaps. So, there's a lot of drugs in use right now that have no data associated with them. So how should we think about filling in those gaps? And finally, ensuring respect, ensuring fair access to life-saving experimental drugs, right? So ensuring that pregnant women have access to COVID vaccines that are approved under emergency use, right? Respect and support for women's decisional authority. Again, I could give a whole talk about the confusion about the circumstances under which consent of the father is required. It's almost never required, and there's arguments that it shouldn't ever be required, but how do we respect pregnant women's decisional authority and contextualize risk findings? So, pregnancy is a situation that is associated with risk. When we identify a signal, how do we contextualize it in the broader range of possible outcomes in pregnancy? So I thought this was a beautiful statement. This occurred around a reticence response. There was a drug that is widely used to treat HIV called dolutegravir that had a possible safety signal associated with a neural tube defect, very, very small signal and uncertain. And the medication was withheld from many pregnant people, and a group of African women living with HIV issued this beautiful longer statement than this, which basically was advocacy for continued access and letting pregnant people decide. It is critical not just to view a pregnant mother or any woman of childbearing potential as a vessel for a baby, but as an individual in her own right who deserves access to the very best evidence-based treatment available and the right to be adequately informed to make a choice she feels is best for her. So here we are again, months into COVID, and pregnant people do face this question about whether to take the vaccine or not in the absence of evidence. Almost on cue, this morning I got a notification in my inbox that Pfizer and biotech are commencing a global clinical trial to evaluate COVID-19 vaccine in pregnant women. 4,000 women are going to be enrolled. So, it has been slow going, but I do believe that there has been a sea change, and that the number of times I've been called by people to comment on this issue is very reassuring to me, because at least people are talking about it right now. So I'm hopeful that we are rounding the corner, and at least that our daughters will have access to enough evidence to make robustly informed decisions when they are pregnant. Thank you. That's the end.
Thank you, Annie. Thank you. That was amazing. And you've given us an awful lot to think about, which is really wonderful. So let me, I know that we have some questions in the Q&A that I am going to pose to you. So the first one really relates to the kind of standardized way that people think about pregnancy in terms of trimesters, and wonders whether there are recommendations about using pregnant people as research subjects that should be geared toward phase or trimester of pregnancy. That is to say, is it safer to think about conducting research at one point or another, or what would you say about sort of the full spectrum of pregnancy?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, it's one of the things that people reasonably raise as this is like one thing that makes pregnant people different is that the physiology, the risks, et cetera, associated with first trimester pregnancy are different than those associated with the third trimester. So one of the answer to this is kind of like, it depends, of course. So, on the one hand, the second and third trimesters are periods of time when we're less worried about, for instance, teratogenic risk, right? There are, profound physiologic differences that happen there, but teratogenic risk is not something that we worry about. So there's some interventions that might more reasonably start later in pregnancy. This is how some of the really innovative studies were done with HIV prevention medications. So starting like right at term, and then when that seemed to be safe, moving back a little farther and moving back a little farther, just to sort of eke our way into thinking about risk. But, it's important to know that, there's some risks that you worry about more later in pregnancy, like preterm birth. So there may be studies that you would feel better about doing when risks of starting labor were not didn't prevail. I mean, the other thing just to know is that there's a lot of low-hanging fruit, if you will, that can be gathered from women who become pregnant while participating in a study, right? So we know that there are many studies, especially for situations that commonly occur where there's high pregnancy rates, and the exposure actually, if you fall pregnant during the study, the exposure is happening before you know you're pregnant and during the time of organogenesis. So those kinds of data are really valuable because they can provide signals or reassurances to other women who will be taking whatever drug there is, and get pregnant, without, unintentionally. And so, there are opportunities and considerations for different trimesters, I guess is the bottom line.
Thank you. Before I move to the next question, let me just remind folks, if you have a question, please type it into the Q&A feature, and we'll do our best to get to it. So next question then. What's the experience with pregnant women readily volunteering? So this is about willingness, right?
Yeah.
Readily volunteering to participate in research, and those few drug development studies that did include them. Is there a concern that those who volunteer for such studies may be disproportionately from low resource or marginalized communities, especially if incentives are involved?
Yeah, like such an important question. So, so first of all, I think, it's important to think back on the arguments made against the inclusion of women in research, which were, which presumed that women wouldn't be willing to participate in research. And that worry has been raised among pregnant people, but my sense from folks who have done a lot of research with pregnant people is that recruitment has really not been an issue, at least in volume. Now, I did an interview study with a group of women who had participated in a vaccine research study during the last pandemic, the flu pandemic. And it was very interesting because there was a diversity of people that participated in this study, which was in some ways reassuring. But among the among the participants were, PhD or postdocs, highly educated people, and their reasons for participating in this this vaccine research were quite interesting, which included like the idea that you could get access to a vaccine before you normally would have, right? The other interesting notion that we've heard actually across the board is people understand that we don't have data about these things in pregnancy. And the idea that you would take a drug or an intervention that you normally would have taken, but you would be watched more closely, you would be monitored because you're in a study rather than being given the drug or the vaccine in your prenatal clinic and then be sent along on your way. So the idea of being monitored more closely is a reason that some people participate across the board. But nevertheless, I think it is always really important to be vigilant, especially in studies that don't obviously have a benefit to them. To be vigilant that that women are given the opportunity not to participate and are given full information and have really valid autonomy when they are making decisions about whether to participate or not. So I think as with many populations, it's always an important consideration, but I think we just need to keep our eye on it as we move forward.
Thanks. Let me ask you a sort of a related question that's here in the Q&A, and it relates to COVID vaccine. So the question says, in the news recently, there's mention that there'd be clinical trials available for pregnant women, pregnant people to participate in as relates to the COVID vaccine. You mentioned that at the end of your talk. And the question really wonders if you would comment on those kinds of trials and whether participation is something that women should be considering, given the messaging about dilemmas to about access to vaccines for pregnant people. So how do you weigh in? Or how do you think that pregnant people might weigh in the choice between just taking a COVID vaccine versus participating in a trial?
Yeah, I think it's a really complicated issue, and this is would be very fun to have an ethics seminar about, because I was not around the table when they made decisions about this trial. And I will learn more about it and think more about it later. But one of the interesting things about the proposed trial, from my understanding right now, is that it's a randomized placebo-controlled trial. So it's not, so half of the people or some proportion of the people are not going to get live vaccine until after they give, or not live vaccine, vaccine until after they give birth, right? And I am sure that there were a lot of conversations about the ethics and the science around the need for doing a placebo-controlled trial. I think, before we had any vaccines, this is why it would have been nice to include pregnant people, in November in the phase 2 and 3 trials, because it's not ethically complicated to participate in a placebo-controlled trial. You're at phase 3, it's looking good, it's looking efficacious. But now that you have an effective vaccine, the placebo arm is complicated. I mean, it's complicated for anybody. It's complicated for the next round of vaccines. It's complicated for children. And it's complicated for pregnant people, especially people who may not have access to vaccine right now. So maybe they don't think they're going to get access until July. So it's worth a 50-50 chance right now if you're really thinking about benefit. There's obviously some good scientific reasons to do this, because what we know about pregnancy is that it is not a no risk situation. There's high miscarriage rates, there's high preterm birth rates, there's high rates of diabetes and all kinds of adverse outcomes that scare scientists that are very familiar to OBGYNs and that, pregnant women would like to avoid, and making sure that those are really truly are just coming along with pregnancy and not associated with the vaccine is important, right? Is an important part of a trial and probably the reason that they decided to randomize. But I do think that the justification for randomize is ethically complicated. I would love to hear your thoughts about it too.
I think it is difficult. I think the timing issue is difficult on its own, let alone the issues around the placebo control. Essentially having a trial start now and having the trial end when vaccination will be, we project fairly widely open.
Yeah.
Really, if the message is we need these data in order to feel comfortable about vaccinating pregnant people, you really delay access in a way that is really problematic.
Yeah.
But I agree with you that, there needs to be some serious conversation about that placebo control.
Mm-hmm.
There are a couple of other questions in the chat that I want to make sure we try to get to. So we have a couple of minutes left, so relatively quickly. The first thanks you for using the term pregnant people in this presentation and asks if you can speak to how the use of gender-affirming hormone therapy before pregnancy would impact the inclusion of trans gestational parents in pharmaceutical research.
Well, that is a really great question, and I think it is something that the bioethics community is just starting to tackle, and I hope I can be a part of that. But I think they need to be included, and we need to thoughtfully include them, and not just assume that the gender affirming hormones are a reason to exclude any more than the naturally occurring biological hormones were a reason to exclude. So we need to just keep at our, being vigilant about, the patterns of thinking that have marginalized the interests of many people in the biomedical research agenda.
Last question. And the questioner here says it's a pleasure to hear from you again, and that it's a very thoughtful lecture. And I would have to resoundingly second that. You stated that pharma has little incentive to include pregnant people, but would argue that they have the same. But the questioner would argue that they have the same incentive as everyone else, which is money. The disincentive, it would seem, is the potential downstream cost of litigation, which every OB can tell you is exponentially multiplied relative to profits and requires only a modicum, if any, cause and effect in order to be demonstrated. Can you see a way forward for including pregnant people in clinical trials without significant statutory protections for pharma and for researchers?
Well, I think that again, a massive question. And I think that my colleagues in law are probably better placed to answer it. I mean, one of the interesting things that I learned from our legal colleagues was that the most worried about legal risk relates to pregnancy-specific labeling, and that if you don't label something specific to pregnancy and a pregnant person takes it, the liability falls on the learned intermediary, which is the doctor. And if they do label specific to pregnancy, then the pharmaceutical industry assumes more of the risk. So, I think I am hearing, I think there is movement, and I have heard from folks that are thinking that that doing this kind of work is important from both sort of an ethical standpoint and also might be beneficial in terms of from a financial standpoint. For instance, developing a treatment for some of the most common diseases associated with pregnancy like preeclampsia, right? We're still using magnesium sulfate, which is what my mother would have got if she was preeclamptic. So, my hope is that that there is a cultural shift and a tide is turning, and with continued pressure from the media and professional organizations, we're gonna get past these fears.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I mean, this has really been wonderful, and I really, really appreciate your taking the time to share your expertise with us today. And as I said before, you've given us so much to think about, and it's just, there are obviously so many more issues. It would be great if we could have a day to talk with you, but we don't. And so I want to honor everyone's time. I'm wondering if you could advance to your final slide. So
that's what I was supposed
the
to
next
be.
one, there we go. So that people can see our next ethics grand rounds will be on community engaged research for innovation and for equity. Dr. Michelle Allen from our program in health disparities research will be presenting. The theme of all our ethics grand rounds talks this year is equity. The center does a lot of work on these issues, and we think now is a fantastic time to really be emphasizing that work. And again, let me just thank Dr. Lyerly for joining us today. We really, really appreciate your time.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here.
Thanks, everybody. Hope to see you all next month.